tonight, we are going to be speaking with Dr. Bacevich. But first, let me introduce my co-host from the Columbia University chapter, Emmanuel Hannibal. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you so much for organizing this. I'm very excited. I am Emmanuel. I am from Columbia College. I'm a history major and a junior and trying to start John Quincy Adams Society. When I first found the chapter, it was actually after I had found and read Dr. Bacevich's The New American Militarism. And it had essentially answered a question that I had when I first got into foreign policy, which is why I couldn't really find any framework talked about in Washington that I felt like really presented a way to look at the world and a framework that was not focused on essentially interventionism or isolationism. And so I'm excited for Columbia students to hear Dr. Bacevich's expertise. And I thank you for your time for organizing this and for Dr. Bacevich's time in speaking with us this evening. Dr. Andrew Bacevich is the president of the Quincy Institute. He is the author, co-author, or editor of more than a dozen books, among them The New American Militarism, The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism, Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War, America's War for the Greater Middle East, and The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory. He's professor emeritus of international relations and history at Boston University and a veteran of the United States Army. For my first question, I just want to take us back to a different moment, a moment that almost parallels today in terms of kind of the uncertainty, but then also the potential of an international system in flux. So in 1989, Francis Fukuyama published the now famous essay, The End of History, which provided an intellectual gleam for the American unipolar moment. With a resurgent Russia and an emboldened China, what are the consequences of history returning if we let a Cold War narrative title this moment?
Thanks for having me. Good question. My own sense is that the narrative that emerged in the immediate wake of the Cold War has now been so thoroughly discredited that it no longer really is viable. Fukuyama's essay, and then the book that came out of the essay, made the impact that it did because he was saying what people wanted to hear. In 1989 and for several years thereafter, American elites, to include many academic elites, but certainly foreign policy elites, wanted to see the end of the Cold War as a decisive turning point of immense significance. And Fukuyama was the one who said, yes, it is. This is truth. This describes what's going to happen now. I think we can say now, and this is not picking on Fukuyama, but I think we can say now that that was simply wrong-headed. I mean, bogus. That the end of the Cold War was not insignificant, but was far less significant than we imagined at the time. And I think in some respects, what the foreign policy establishment has been struggling with ever since is to figure out, well, if the fall of the Berlin Wall didn't mark the end of history, then where the heck are we? I mean, what's going on? So that would be my response to your initial question.
To follow up a bit on that, one of your books talks about the post-Cold War era, and you say that we squandered our victory in the Cold War. Could you go a bit into what you mean by that?
I think the sort of the complement to the end of history argument was one that pertained to military power. That history had ended, this argument went, because the United States had had mastered war. What was the evidence of that? Well, the evidence was, first of all, the fact that the Soviets gave up, and we chose, many Americans or people in the West chose to interpret the end of the Cold War as a quasi-military victory, that the Soviets had concluded they couldn't keep up militarily, so they gave up the ghost. I think that was wrongheaded at the time. It's still wrongheaded. But equally important was the fact that, like a year and a half after, less than a year after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Saddam Hussein chose foolishly to invade and annex Kuwait, setting the stage for Operation Desert Storm. First big military undertaking after the Cold War. A lot of concern here in the United States that this could be a bloodbath, a mess, another Vietnam, as some people said. Of course, it turned out to be a relatively short campaign in which Saddam's inept, poorly motivated legions, led by incompetent generals, folded rather quickly. But the conclusion was, this proves that we have achieved military mastery, such as the world has never seen before. So you combine the end of history argument, sort of the ideological argument, with the I think the radically misperceived military situation, and man, we are headed down the wrong path, and I think we have been paying a steep price ever since, and we've especially been paying a steep price since 9/11, which demolished the end of history argument, and certainly has demonstrated that no, indeed, we are not the masters of war.
Thank you. And I think I want to kind of go into your thesis on using militarism and looking at the centrality of the military in U.S. foreign policy based on your 2005 book, The New American Militarism. And you choose metaphors that underlie the psychological and structural entrenchment of the military, and essentially that there are more similarities between administrations than differences between the second Bush administration, let's say the Obama administration. So,
Emmanuel, let me ask you a personal question. How old are you?
I am 20.
So you're asking me a question about a book that I wrote basically when you weren't even born, and you want me to remember it.
Oh, sorry.
I'll do my best.
I just meant more in terms of because it was the book that I had read that made me interested in your writing.
I'm pulling your leg.
But I was just wondering in terms of why you chose that metaphor of militarism and why you felt that it was fitting, and why your conclusion of what went wrong in the Vietnam War and policy after was so distinct from other soldiers' conclusions.
Yeah. Okay, so I was a soldier for a time. I served in the Vietnam War. I served on active duty from 1969 to 1992. The book you just alluded to came out in 2005. In other words, it came out in the early stages of the global war on terror, in the early stages of the Iraq War, which I certainly opposed. The argument in the book was shaped by the fact that I was a Vietnam veteran. You young people can look back on your lives already and say, well, that was a moment that really affected my outlook on life or on America's role in the world. For me and for others of my generation, even today, perhaps inappropriately, we look back at the Vietnam War as formative, as a turning point. So as I was trying to understand our American collective attitude with regard to war and military power, and I say our, I mean citizens, I mean the political establishment. I'm doing this basically in the wake of 9/11, trying to figure out where these attitudes came from. probably inappropriately in a way, I tell my stories, I situate the beginning of my story at Vietnam. And the story that book tries to tell is that various constituencies saw Vietnam as a disaster, which it was, and persuaded themselves that the reconstitution of American military power offered the way not simply to recover from Vietnam, but offered the way to move forward to achieve our, self-described destiny. A small example, if you will, from the book. There's a chapter in the book about conservative evangelicals. Conservative evangelicals in the latter part of the 20th century were persuaded, I'm not an evangelical, I'm a Catholic, but I'm also persuaded that morally the country was going to hell in a handbasket. And they persuaded themselves that incorrectly, they persuaded themselves that the military, the armed services, were a place where traditional virtues flourished and could be maintained. And therefore, from a political point of view, embracing the armed forces, embracing the military, offered one way toward trying to reverse the corruption, the moral corruption, which they dated from the 1960s, and bringing about a moral rejuvenation. Now, the book says that there are a variety of groups in American society that engaged in a similar, and I think similarly flawed argument, all of which led them to believe that, by God, American military power has the potential to fix whatever is wrong in American society. Out of that comes militarism. Out of that comes the misuse of American military power, especially after 9/11. Out of that comes, this is well beyond what the book says, out of that comes where we are today.
I think that invites kind of a follow-up question, about civil-military relations, that what you're describing is an unhealthy civil-military relationship where there's an element of deference that might not be appropriate, and a kind of perception that there's a superiority on the part of the military to the rest of society, as opposed to the military being drawn from and a part of society. What do you think a more healthy civil-military relationship would look like, and how would you assess in particular today the civil-military relationship?
Well, deeply flawed, problematic, and screwed up. This is something that John and I have a point of view that I have been promoting for years with no success. I don't mean only limited success. I mean no success whatsoever. What's the essence of the argument? The essence of the argument is this. Going back to the founding of the Republic, you might even say before the founding of the Republic, during the colonial era, the basis of the American military system was the citizen soldier. The notion was that when the Republic was in danger, it would call upon citizens to rally to the colors and do what was necessary in order to preserve our freedoms. I'm stating it in a simplified way, but you can go back, let's say, to the American Revolution. We all know, honor, and respect the efforts of George Washington's Continental Army. We know much less about was the fact that the state militias provided absolutely essential backup to the Continental Army. I would argue that we would not have been able to achieve our independence were it not for the contribution of the state militias. If we look at U.S. military history after gaining independence, the regular army, the full-timers, people like I used to be, actually were relatively inconsequential. Whenever we went to war, 1812, 1846, 1861, 1898, 1917, 1941. Whenever we went to war in a serious way, the federal government turned to the citizen soldier to bear the brunt of combat. In the 19th century, it tended to be by calling up volunteers. It was volunteer regiments fought the Civil War. In the 20th century, it tended to be citizen soldiers conscripted. That's what happened in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. But it was citizen soldiers, not the regulars, who bore the brunt of defending our freedom or taking whatever we wanted. For example, in the Mexican War, when we decided we wanted California, it was citizen soldiers who fought that fight. That system collapses with Vietnam. The military system dependent upon citizen soldiers collapses as a result of Vietnam. And with good reason, because the Vietnam War was so utterly wrong-headed, unnecessary, costly, mismanaged. It's not a surprise that the American people said, enough. President Nixon, concerned mostly for domestic political reasons, not because he had some grand concept of civil military relations, killed the military system dependent upon the citizen soldier and replaced it with what we have today, which is a standing army. That's what the founders would have called it. We call it the all-volunteer force. It's a professional military. And it's a military that many people have argued, and I have argued, is become detached from American society. It's not representative of American society. Now, we all mouth the necessary platitudes about respecting the troops. We all applaud at the Super Bowl. But the fact of the matter is, and it's an important fact, is that the American people have become disengaged from their military. And I would argue that has not served the Republic well. It has not served the Republic well from a military point of view. I mean, if there is a lesson from the post 9/11 wars, it is that the all-volunteer force doesn't win. We didn't win in Iraq. We sure as heck didn't win in Afghanistan. So we're told we have the best military in the world. Oh, yeah? How come it doesn't win? That clearly is a problem. And beyond that, I think that the current military system is one that it cheapens our understanding of citizenship. In other words, I can be a good citizen if I serve. I can be a good citizen if I don't serve. Military service has nothing to do with whether or not I'm a good citizen. And I believe it is to the great credit of Columbia, Emmanuel, your school, that there are a very large number of recent veterans who are enrolled in Columbia. And that is unusual. The number of veterans who are undergraduates at Princeton or Harvard or Dartmouth or Stanford is mostly in the single digits. And that is indicative of the reality of the civil military relationship that exists today. So God bless Columbia, but unfortunately, Columbia is not, is not being mirrored by the practices in other prestige universities.
Thank you, Dr. Bacevich. I think it is interesting to look at Columbia just being a unique university and having a lot of, we have general studies. And so that's why we see a lot of veterans of my history courses. Right. But I kind of wanted to go to the point you were talking about in terms of civil military relations, is that since Vietnam War, more and more U.S. foreign policy has distanced and the American public have distanced themselves from the military. And so I was wondering if how militarism and why you chose militarism as a description of what's wrong with American foreign policy since the Vietnam War relates to kind of the history of militarism in the 20th century, which is that it's a separate class, but then also it's an entity that's further and further separated from the public. And that part of the reason with militarism is that we don't fully, the American public doesn't fully know the breadth of the military footprint on the world stage.
Well, I should have a copy of my book. I know the book provides a definition of militarism as I use it, but it relates to exaggerated expectations of what military power can do. That military power is a tool that can be used to solve all kinds of problems. And I think that very much describes the attitudes that existed in Washington in the wake of the Cold War, and that attitude then finds expression in an extraordinary number of armed interventions. And also, there's this notion that somehow the United States military represents the best of what we stand for. I hold the troops in high regard. But I don't delude myself into thinking that members of the 82nd Airborne Division are somehow more virtuous than undergraduates at Columbia University. There's nothing about military service per se that encourages virtue, enlightenment. But I think that attitude also tended to come into play in the wake of the Cold War.
So just to follow up on this a bit, to play devil's advocate here, if someone were to say, or how would you react to this? To say the United States has a healthy civil-military relationship. We haven't had coups. There's not even serious talk of that kind of thing. When people talked about the idea of, the military intervening in our elections in recent cycles, it was treated as a fringe idea by and large. The branches work together. There still seems to be civilian control of the military. Generals basically retire roughly when they're supposed to. You don't have, these 80-year-old guys in uniform that are, fully political generals. And therefore we have a healthy
I'm not sure you're right on that point, John.
Okay. Well, yeah. Tell me why that's
wrong. But I think more broadly, my response is, yeah, you're probably about right. And that's an inadequate definition of what a healthy civil-military relationship should provide for. The fact that there has been no coup doesn't mean we have a healthy system. It seems to me that the better criteria would be, well, does the civil-military relationship provide for the security of our nation at a reasonable cost? And does it enhance democratic practice? And I would say that the answer to those questions is hell no. Again, we have to factor in the outcome of our recent wars in evaluating the civil-military relationship. Think about Afghanistan. It's kind of like COVID in the sense that it's difficult to get your brain around the number of Americans who have died from this pandemic over the past 2 years. I mean, it is almost inconceivable. The comparison is not perfect, But I would say something of the same thing about the Afghanistan war. Hey, wait a second. We fought a war for 20 years, the longest in our history. Nobody will ever know how much it costs. I think the Brown University Cost of War Project estimates Afghanistan at something like $1.5 trillion to $2 trillion. We got another $5 trillion that went into Iraq. We have a couple more trillion projected for veterans costs over the next, 20, 30, 40 years. And we failed. John, there's something wrong here. What is it? And that's a question that it seems to me that our civil-military relationship dodges. We're not supposed to ask those kinds of things. I mean, I find that to be a travesty. It's immoral. It's certainly undemocratic. I mean, my God, don't we owe it to the soldiers who served in Afghanistan and also in Iraq and all these other places to have some amount of accountability that says, well, here we have studied this problem, and here's why we think things ended up as they did. And by extension, we're deriving some lessons from these episodes that are going to apply to future U.S. policy. But the civil-military relationship that we have, which is one that says, we love the troops, but we have no idea what they're doing, that's a relationship that gets in the way of serious accountability. And obviously, by the tone of my voice, you can tell that really, really, really sticks in my craw.
I think you raised a lot of questions that Americans were feeling for a moment when we saw essentially the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I think that's where some of the guilt comes from in terms of—
Emmanuel, I'm sorry, I got to interrupt. Because you are right. At the moment of the evacuations from Kabul, people paid attention. People felt bad. People said, man, there's something wrong here. But what they felt bad about was the evacuation. The evacuation happened at the very end of a 20-year war that ended in failure. And it's the 20-year war that ended in failure that should cause us as citizens to say, man, that's unacceptable.
Entirely. And with that in mind, I think you've written in some articles recently about what the Biden administration is intending to do with essentially this withdrawal from Afghanistan. And a lot of it's focused on China. And I was wondering if you could consider this question in terms of your larger framework in critiquing the centrality of the U.S. military and foreign policy is the effect that U.S. militarization of foreign policy for the past 50 years has then shaped the international system. So with many resurgent powers, they often interpret nuclear armament, military power projection, and spheres of influence as symbols of achieving a great power status, much like Iran, North Korea, and China. So then how can the United States escape this militarist paradox? Its legacy as a military hegemony still defines the implicit rules of our international system.
Well, I think the place to begin is, what are we worried about? What should we be worried about? I mean, Emmanuel, if I may, let me just flip it back to you. A serious question now. As you think about the country's future, the planet's future, your future, what do you worry about?
Climate change and also instability in government.
And what?
Instability in government from essentially economic policy. And
you mean our own government?
Our own and a lot of other governments, I think.
Okay. Sign me up. Whatever you're for, I'm for too. I think that's exactly right. That to me, as an old guy, the climate crisis defines the existential threat to our well-being. And of course, obviously, not just to us, but to the entire planet. That's problem number one. Okay, there are others. I am almost as troubled by the deterioration of the absence of any kind of conception of a common good, which most Americans can say, yeah, I'll sign up to that. That's what we believe in. I am beyond troubled, by the insurrection, by the efforts to overturn the election, by the discourse today that projects, political crisis in this election year or political crisis in the next presidential election. I never imagined that the Republic would be in such dire straits. So that's, to me, climate crisis, the domestic crisis. Those are the big two. Therefore, when people start talking to me about China or Ukraine, I'm saying, man, that's not where our attention needs to be. I'm not arguing that Ukraine doesn't matter. I'm not arguing that China's ambitions don't matter. I am arguing that they are not the primary threats to our republic. And it's exceedingly important for us to have clear priorities. I also believe that American military power, which is still substantial, notwithstanding our failures in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, ain't going to fix the climate crisis, ain't going to fix the domestic crisis. That's not an argument for disarmament. That's not an argument for ignoring aggressive behavior by countries like Iraq and China and Russia. It is an argument for keeping things in perspective. I mean, if the current conventional wisdom in Washington, I think, is that we need to have this tilt toward Asia, and tilt translates into repositioning American military power in order to try to contain China. I get the logic of that. I get the way that that sort of plays off of what we did with regard to the Soviet Union early in the Cold War. But I don't think that gets our priorities right. So I think it is crucially important for us as citizens to engage political leaders in a conversation about what is it that puts at risk the safety and well-being of you, Emmanuel, and of my children and my grandchildren. And I simply do not believe that Russia's pressures on Ukraine make the top of the list.
Sorry, John, just one quick question. In terms of that being I think what you're talking about too is just a way that the United States handles policy in general, which is crisis management. So in terms of, whatever impending crisis, whether or not it's Russian troops in the border of Ukraine or whether or not China is going to invade Taiwan, that also can be seen in an economic lens as well. How can Americans, how can we get our political leaders to essentially think in such a long-term framework that they've been unable to do with climate change domestically and with other issues? Yeah,
if I could answer your question, I would be rich and famous, because it does seem to me that what we in the Quincy Institute refer to as the blob, the foreign policy establishment, is in many respects still a prisoner of the Cold War paradigm, still wants to believe, insists upon believing that the end of the Cold War created a unipolar order with the United States as the sole superpower. I mean, those notions were very popular back in, let's say, the early 1990s. In my judgment, events have totally discredited them. But it does seem to me that in terms of the of the foreign policy conversation, those notions haven't gone away. And let us bring, I think one of you wanted to ask me a question. Emmanuel, you wanted to ask me a question about American exceptionalism. I mean, this may be the ultimate sort of example of unrealistic thinking. You know, the conviction that we are the chosen people, the new chosen people. That somebody, God, providence, history, somebody calls upon the United States to somehow guide humanity to some intended conclusion. Some people say that out loud. I think some people don't say it out loud, but they basically work on the assumption that it expresses some kind of a deep truth. And it's insidious. We need to get over it. And I wish I could tell you how to do that, but I can't.
Do you think that it's possible to have a healthy vision of exceptionalism? You know, because like, for instance, the way I read John Quincy Adams' 1821 speech, he seems to be offering an exceptionalist vision, but one that is not focused on the United States going out and making everybody emulate our system, even though he thought our system was basically the best system, and even though he thought that, you know, the United States had a unique place in the world, that, you know, being separated from Europe and all that we were offering a new political model to the world, but that again we wouldn't be imposing that by force. Is that a sustainable, cogent idea for the United States to take as its ethos?
I think, John, that I react negatively to the whole notion of exceptionalism. I heard what you just said, and I don't necessarily argue against the details. What I would say is, look, we need to be the best America we can be. You know, we have a constitution that we should cherish. Some of us seem to have lost faith in that Constitution. We have a history, which is a mixed history of great accomplishment and also of very significant sins and failings. But when you go back to the founding documents, and when you go back to the statements of people like Abraham Lincoln, there was so much to admire there. And what we should be doing is trying to make good on those aspirations. You know, and President Xi can do whatever the heck he wants to with China. You know, they may have a different vision and maybe a good vision for them, but we're trying to be the best America we can be. And the inclination of the post-Cold War era, which is to use American military power to make them, whoever they are, do it our way, has tended to be a costly failure. You know, I've cited Iraq and Afghanistan. Let's talk about Libya. You know, let's talk about Somalia. You know, the record of American military interventionism has been largely counterproductive. And my God, it has been costly. What did I just read today, John? You probably saw it. Is it the national debt just exceeded? Is it $30 trillion? I think it's $30 trillion.
That may be. It's certainly north of 20.
And you would say, well, yeah, but we just print the money because we got the world's reserve currency, so we don't have to worry about it. Yeah, well, I'm not an economist, but it just seems to me that it is at least possible that rule is not going to pertain to all eternity, and that someday that debt is going to matter.
I just have a question in terms of, I think you accurately critique a lot of the problems in which when Americans are thinking about U.S. policy and interaction globally, in solely military terms, it's limiting. And I was wondering if you had a positive image, if it's not exceptionalism, what framework should the United States take in terms of how we lead on the global stage? Because in many ways, we're in a very globalized society. We're seeing, how we're seeing our regional issues reverberate in the global economic system, such as the supply chain crisis. And so, what is a way for the United States to interact globally, still be engaged in terms of protecting economic interests that isn't just about thinking differently and moving away from the military and responding to a climate crisis? Is there not a Build Back Better, but in many ways, often policy is articulated well when there's a name or a title or an ideal that Americans can understand and grasp for what's directing, let's say, the Biden administration in terms of policy. I don't know if that made sense, but do you have
it
better?
did.
Okay.
I don't think I'm going to give you the label, but it seems to me that the urgent requirement is to model a sustainable conception of freedom. We have a conception of freedom. I mean, you all may disagree with me, but I think that the prevailing conception of freedom, going back to when I was a kid, okay, this is not new. The prevailing conception of freedom is based on consumption, choice, and mobility. Those three things. To be an American is to consume more, to have a range of choice of things. I don't want the blue one, I want the orange one. And mobility, meaning when I want to go somewhere, I can go there because I have a car, because I can get on an airplane. So that, to me, those have been the notions that have defined the conception. We talk about, I don't mean to dismiss rights and the like, but what people want when they come to America from other countries is choice, consumption, and mobility. How to reconcile those with the well-being of the planet? I think that's the question. I think that is a tough one. I mean, in my family, we're currently having a discussion about summer vacation. My kids, my grandkids like to do something. We're not going to take a round the world cruise, for 142 days, but we want to go somewhere. We want to have fun. How do we think about that aspiration in terms of the well-being of the planet? How do we think about that in terms of having to curb our appetite for choice, consumption, and mobility? I think these are pretty tough, This means forfeiting things that have made life in America worthwhile. But if indeed we begin with the premise that climate change is an existential threat, then we have to address those. Who is the politician? Who is the politician who's going to say, well, elect me president because I will curtail your choice, your consumption, and your mobility on behalf of the health of the planet? That person won't make it past the first primary, the New Hampshire primary. But it seems to me that gets to what we ought to be talking about. And again, it's a heck of a lot more important than Ukraine. I not mean any disrespect to the people of Ukraine, but I'm not sure that the independence of Ukraine is necessarily going to affect the security and well-being of my grandchildren.
Got another question. This is from Cole Daubney, who asks, do you think that defense contracting companies have an impact on our foreign policy more than they should, whether at a congressional level or, say, in the Department of Defense?
Was that Cole, like C-O-L-E?
Defense contracting companies.
No, the questioner.
Oh, Cole is his name, yes.
I think Cole is pulling our leg, John. Of course they do. Come on. I mean, this is a source of vast corruption in our politics that goes back decades. Eisenhower was right. And his warning remains as pertinent as when he issued it in January of 1961. I mean, the whole role of money in American politics, it's beyond troubling. But again, I would argue that because we insist upon a globalized military posture, a military services designed for global power projection, because we insist that we need to have 750, whatever the number is, foreign military bases. All of that plays into the hands of the military-industrial complex, plays into the hands of the weapons manufacturers. It's been in the papers. It's not been a big deal. But I mean, in the most recent defense authorization bill, the Congress authorized a level of spending above what the administration requested. Why did they do that? Well, they do that because individual members of Congress are trying to satisfy constituents, to keep building these airplanes or these submarines or whatever it is that provides economic benefit to their own constituents. So this is a deeply troubling practice. And you sort of say, my God, how long does this need to go on before there is a substantial reaction? But again, I think that the place to begin to get at the military-industrial complex is to reconceptualize what U.S. national security priorities.
I just kind of wanted to figure out where I wanted to kind of have one of the last questions, and I guess that's why what you think the specific impact that the Quincy Institute can have on DC foreign policy, the DC foreign policy bubble, and what impact you'd like to see in the next 5 years. I know it was created in 2019, but right. In what ways is this combating essentially the how entrenched military policy is in foreign policy, and what other ways do you think you can work with proponents of foreign?
So John will appreciate that the Quincy Institute is named after John Quincy Adams. And sort of our sacred text, I suppose, is that famous speech that he gave warning against the United Americans going abroad in search of monsters to destroy, and insisting that were we to do that, that we would put American freedom in jeopardy. So we begin with we posit that, yeah, that's happened. That's what we've done. We've gone abroad in search of monsters to destroy. We've put American freedom in jeopardy. So we're a small think tank, as you just suggested, just a couple of years old. We stand for restraint. It's just one word. We stand for restraint. What's restraint mean? What restraint means, it doesn't mean disarmament, doesn't mean pacifism, doesn't mean we think that the world is full of people who, like us, but it does mean that we wish to see the United States be more cautious in the use of American military power, to intervene less frequently, to consider whether or not we are devoting too many resources to maintaining military power, that resources should go to other national priorities. We believe that that there is a need for American diplomacy to be more effective, which probably implies State Department reform. That's what we stand for. To emphasize, we are nonpartisan, or we like to say transpartisan. I mean, if somebody listening to this says, I'm a liberal, man, we want you as part of Quincy. If you think I'm a conservative, we want you as part of Quincy. If you believe that the paradigm of U.S. national security policy over the past 30 years or so has ill-served the nation, if you think that U.S. policy has been excessively militarized, that there should be an alternative, we want you on Quincy, okay? That's what we're all about. I'm an old guy. Most of the people in Quincy are really young. They are full of fire. They are smart. They are fun. And I would urge anybody who's tuned into this to, check us out.
So, well, following up with that, talking about that alternative vision, why have we gone down this other path and gone down it so far, especially since the end of the Cold War? We just constantly seem to be getting ourselves involved in new conflicts. What's the driving force behind that? Why is that happening?
Well, I mean, it is, all the end of history kind of illusions. But I've come to believe, John, that the ultimate explanation in some respects is World War II. The way we have chosen to remember, to enshrine World War II into our national story, to enshrine it as a story of good versus evil, in which we were good. We and the Brits were good. And the Nazis were evil. And they were evil. And they needed to be destroyed. Oh, by the way, Nazi Germany would not have been destroyed were it not for the efforts of the Red Army, led by Joseph Stalin, who was also evil. In other words, World War II was morally complicated. And I think it is our unwillingness to acknowledge those moral complications, which in some senses helps to keep alive the Manichaean narrative that tends to inform U.S. policy to the present moment. Again, I'm from the Vietnam generation. Again, I'm probably more affected by the Vietnam War than I ought to be in terms of my mindset. But, Vietnam pretty much has cured me of any conviction that we are the savior nation. I accept that our history has been complicated. There's lots of good, there's lots of not so good. And I think that we need to recognize that going forward as we try to deal with the problems that we face in the present moment, whether it's China or whether it's Russia or whether it's climate change or whether it's our enormous domestic challenges.
I just have one last question, and I think it's kind of a theme that we've been touching and talking about this entire evening, is that it seems that the American militarism kind of reflects this internal yearning for the righteousness, for the image of ourselves that we had at the end of World War II. I think that's part of why the unipolar moment was so memorable for a lot of Americans, I think, who lived through it, at least from what I learned from when I was reading a lot about how Colin Powell was a part of that movement. And so we are at a moment where domestic politics continue to essentially spiral and get more and more contentious. And I think that affects foreign policy and also affects the way that we're going to respond to a lot of these crises. So, it seems like the Vietnam War caused a lot of crisis, but ultimately we you talked about the evangelicals essentially turning toward the U.S. military then being something that would essentially serve as the protector of morals that they were seeing go away in American society. So do you think that we're capable of having the internal reckoning that's necessary to truly, I think, examine our militarism and examine the future that we're looking toward with climate change?
I'm going to punt on you. I mean, it remains to be seen. Signs aren't particularly good. I define myself as a conservative, not as a Republican, for God's sakes. But it does seem to me that one of the really big problems of our politics today is that we really don't have a two-party system. We don't have two parties, each of which has a definable identity, each of which is devoted to a certain set of principles. For all that I would say is sort of unfortunate about the Democratic Party, it does represent a kind of principled liberal point of view. That's what the Democratic Party is supposed to do. It's great. We have a Republican Party that represents no principles whatsoever. I mean, it seems to be sort of an adjunct of the previous president. It's not a conservative party. So I do think that maybe not the ultimate answer, but a prerequisite to putting the country back together again is for the Republican Party to rediscover a set of conservative principles that can be the basis of what that party stands for. And then we can have a great, interesting debate, liberal principles, conservative principles. And out of that debate might come some conclusions that would lead to a new understanding of the common good, moving beyond the sort of the contentious period that we are experiencing right now. I don't know, but I think that's my view. We need to have a real two-party system.
All right. Well, that is all the time we have. Emmanuel in Colombia, thank you for co-hosting this event with us. Dr. Bacevich, thank you for serving as our guest. Thank you to all of you out there in the audience for attending. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you all next Wednesday. Good night.
Thanks a lot for having me. Appreciate it.